Man, 2022 was a wild year for gaming. There were so many games released in 2022, and we had some great heavy hitters like Elden Ring, God of War Ragnarok, and Xenoblade Chronicles 3. But not only do we have the two most anticipated games released this year, we also had a lot of really good indie games that got released. We had Cult of the Lamb, Stray, Vampire Survivors, although it technically came out on early access in 2021, but it still counts because it officially released in 2022. Evil West, Neon White, Tunic, Signalis, and so much more. And even some older fan favorite console games that finally got ported over to PC like Persona 5 Royal, God of War 2018, Marvel's Spider-Man, Horizon Zero Dawn, and Final Fantasy VII Remake. This year has probably got to be one of the best years to be a gamer. It's no exaggeration to say that we gamers were eating good in 2022. And perhaps some might say that we even feasted like kings. This year is a celebration of just good games with very little BS attached to them like a blood-sucking parasite. But like every celebration, there needs to be that one guy who drinks way too much to the point where he's stumbling around like an idiot making a fool of himself. And instead of being funny, it just ends up being depressing because he spends all his time getting shit-faced drunk every night while working a dead-end job with no career prospects. Even though he graduated high school at the top of his class and was voted to be most successful in his grade. Look, the point is that the games on this list had a lot of hype and expectations on them when they were first revealed prior to release. And when these games did release, they were a massive letdown, killing everyone's hype boner. Now, the games on this list don't necessarily have to be bad games per se, but they did have to have a decent amount of hype before their release, all for them just to flop epically, or mediocrely in some case, on release day. And disclaimer, this list is entirely my opinion and the games here aren't really in a particular order. Anyway, without further ado, let's get on to the video.
Dragon Adventure, baby! Come get it!
First up on this list of disappointing games is Tiny Tina's Wonderlands. Now, you're probably asking, why is this game on here? I thought this was a pretty good game. And you would be right, it actually is a pretty good game. The gameplay loop is still the same Borderlands we all know and love, but with a D&D coat of paint. And its spin on the class system is really interesting, where you can combine two classes together to make your own unique build. And even though this was a spin-off game, Tiny Tina's Wonderlands looked really sick in the reveal trailers, with magic and bows and melee weapons. It could have even been as good as Borderlands 3, gameplay wise. But there were a couple fatal flaws that held TTW back from becoming the next great Borderlands game. First, and probably the biggest one, is that there's no New Game Plus. Yeah, a Borderlands game that doesn't have New Game Plus. Instead, they've replaced it with a shitty endgame called Chaos Dungeons, where you're running the same maps over and over again for the best weapons. There are no raids, no real endgame, just Chaos Dungeons, and it gets repetitive fast. The second reason why this game didn't really hit the mark is because the DLC content is lacking. Borderlands was always known for its great DLC content that added a lot of interesting lore, weapons, and areas. But TTW doesn't do this. Instead, they did something called post-launch content, or PLCs. And these PLCs are absolute dog water. All they really are just Chaos Dungeons, but reskinned with one new boss. Whoop-de-doo, it still sucks. Overall, I'm not saying Tiny Tina's Wonderlands was a bad game, it's just that it had little replay value, which the Borderlands games were known for. And I just kinda wish that Gearbox had put more effort into the endgame. Next on this list is Overwatch 2. I feel like Blizzard Entertainment had some really interesting marketing for this game. When they first revealed it, they marketed it as more of a PvE experience with more of a focus on story rather than multiplayer. Blizzard later scrapped that idea and decided to make it a PvP experience. I guess not to alienate the player base of Overwatch 1 too much, since Blizzard was planning to migrate them over to Overwatch 2. The thing about it was that when they announced a co-op PvE mode, people were genuinely interested in what Blizzard had to offer because it was genuinely new spin on the Overwatch IP. But when they changed it back to PvP, that's when the disappointment started to set in. Because when they finally released it in beta and everyone was able to see gameplay of Overwatch 2, we were all confused because Overwatch 2 looked and played exactly almost like Overwatch 1. We all thought that Blizzard somehow made a mistake and accidentally re-released Overwatch 1 again. Hell, the launch icon doesn't even say Overwatch 2. Of course, there are some differences between 1 and 2, like 2 being a 5v5 instead of a 6v6, and some heroes being changed for balancing and the different hero looks. But everything else looked identical to Overwatch 1. People were even calling it Overwatch 1.5 with how similar the two games were. And they were right to call it that. Overwatch 2 felt more like an expansion rather than being a full sequel deserving of a 2 in the name. At least the silver lining of this is that if you liked Overwatch 1's gameplay, then you'll probably be fine with 2's because they're so similar. Whew, that's a lot of Overwatches. The next game on this list is Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. It seems like the past couple of years, Game Freak has been getting real lazy with the quality of Pokemon games, because it's been getting worse and worse every iteration of a mainline Pokemon game. We started to see this decline with the transition to 3D, because the Pokemon just didn't have the same soul like previous entries had. And in Sword and Shield, it was really apparent when fan favorite features were removed, like the National Dex. And not only that, but the technical quality has been getting worse and worse every year. Now fast forward to Gen 9, where we arrive at Pokemon Scarlet and Violet's release, which has got to be the buggiest, ugliest, and most soulless Pokemon game to date. Where do I even start? The first thing is that this Pokemon's release had a slew of bugs and glitches, not to mention the technical issues it had. The game ran at a consistent 30 FPS, and depending on where you were in the overworld, it was even less. Why is it like this? It's not like the Switch can't handle an open world game. It ran Breath of the Wild just fine. Not to mention the insane amount of bugs and glitches this game has. The second thing that made this game so bad for me was that the graphics and textures were even worse than Sword and Shield. Remember that meme with the N64 tree back in Sword and Shield? Well, take that meme and apply it to the entire region Paldea, because that's what this game looks like. The textures are muddy and low res, everything is phasing in and out of existence. There's nothing in this region that looks good. This game is just visual vomit. And the third thing that really disappointed me is that the region of Paldea is just absolutely soulless. Pokemon was always known for its vibrant and deep world building, where it feels like there are actual humans living in that world. You could enter someone's house and talk to them. NPCs would have their own wants and desires. These worlds in these past games felt like living, breathing worlds. Scarlet and Violet have none of this. The NPCs feel like robots that say their speech bubbles when the player walks by. They don't do anything, and it's just really off-putting. There's just nothing in this game that looks like it's been inhabited at all. My other problem with Scarlet and Violet is that there's nothing about Paldea that makes it stand out as a region. It's all just barren wastelands with Pokemon littered about. No interesting landmarks, no memorable towns, and a handful of interesting NPCs. The world feels like a ghost town and you just happen to be exploring it. That, for me, was my biggest disappointment for Pokemon Scarlet and Violet.
Peggy 16.
The fourth game on this list is a game where I feel like not very many people played, but for good reason, because this game was dull and I, like a fool, was still hopeful that it would be somewhat interesting. It had ghosts, spirits, and magic, but even then it still manages to have less soul than a bag of bricks. If you couldn't guess, the game we're talking about is Ghostwire Tokyo. Now, I know this is a game that not too many people were excited about, but I still had some hope for Ghostwire Tokyo because to me it kinda looked interesting when they first revealed it a couple years ago. Fool me once I guess, because even though my expectations were low, I was still let down. This game is the textbook definition of mid. The story was forgettable, the gameplay was basic, the only thing that was slightly interesting was villain design, but that just ended up being a big nothing burger. Now, I wouldn't say that the story is bad, but it was just a generic bad guy wants to sacrifice the world to revive his family, which has been way overdone at this point. And the gameplay, it just didn't have enough depth to it to keep me engaged. You get 3 types of magic that have the same purpose, just in a different flavor. You got the single target one, the AoE one, and the bigger AoE one. That's it. And the world, it's literally a ghost town. The only NPCs around are spirits and demons. and there's just very little enemy variety. I think there's like 6 distinct enemy types in this game. The only thing that this game really has going for it is the graphics are pretty good. That's about it. That doesn't help with the fact that I forgot about this game as soon as I completed it, forever lost in the void of obscurity that is my Steam library.
I'm here to kill chaos. That's my mission. Looks like chaos has been waiting for us.
The next game on this list was something that I personally was looking forward to when they first teased it. This game was supposed to be the precursor to the first game in the series and give bigger context and backstory to the villain of it. If you haven't guessed the game yet, I'm talking about Final Fantasy Origins Stranger of Paradise. As a Final Fantasy fan, I was actually excited about the concept of a game that's based on the backstory of the villain in Final Fantasy 1. Then I got the game and started playing it, and I started to realize that this game wasn't what I hoped it would be. I expected it to be a heavily story-based with tons of lore and have really strong characters with deep and emotional dialogue, but nope, we get none of that. Fool me twice, I guess. This game felt like a really dumbed down version of a Final Fantasy game. And yeah, I know it's a spin-off, but that doesn't mean they can't do some world building. I felt like there was a massively missed opportunity when the developers made the world just a bunch of menus. You want to upgrade a weapon? It's in the menu. You want to talk to the NPC? That's also in the menu. There's no way for you to stop and smell the flowers, and I feel like the developers could have added so much more to this game. I will admit though that the gameplay is pretty fun when it's running on all cylinders and you just feel the rush killing enemy after enemy. However, although the gameplay is pretty good and fun at times, this game just seriously lacks the depth that the Final Fantasy franchise is known for. And they still charge full price for this game, which I felt like this game should have been $40 or $50. So that's why Stranger of Paradise earns a spot on this list of disappointing games.
If you're watching this, I'm dead. This is a code black.
The sixth disappointing game for me isn't really a game that I had high expectations for when they first revealed it, because the gameplay looked pretty sluggish and for some reason they added mobile game RPG mechanics to a game that had absolutely no business in dealing with. That's right, I'm talking about Gotham Knights. When the concept of a game where you can play as the Bat family was first revealed, I will admit I was kinda intrigued. After riding off the hype that the Batman games have generated from fans, a game set in the same universe where I can play as the Bat family in a co-op setting sounded really enticing to me. But when I played the game, the slow realization that Gotham Knights is not going to be what I hoped it would be started to set in. There were a lot of questionable design choices that just didn't end up meshing well together. The biggest questionable design choice that the developers made for this game was making it this weird hybrid of action combat and mobile game RPG. And it just does not work at all. It essentially got the worst of both worlds. The action combat is basic and bland, while the RPG aspect is simplistic and adds no real value to the gameplay. Not only that, but the game forces you to do the same side missions over and over again out in the ghost town that is Gotham City. At least the story was pretty decent, but it still couldn't save the gameplay from being less interesting than a wet piece of cardboard. Like, how is it that they had such an easy formula laid out for them to follow, and they still managed to mess it up? Just make Gotham Knights like the Batman games, but instead of playing Batman, you play with the sidekicks. With no mobile game RPG garbage and no repeating side missions, just a straight up action beat 'em up game with a deep story. That's it. But we can only wish. So that's why Gotham Knights is on this list.
Life sign detected.
Grab him.
Hey, what are you doing?
The second to last game on my list of disappointing games is one that had a lot of people actually excited about. This is probably one of the most anticipated games of 2022, and boy did it let us down. It touted itself as the next big survival horror game that was supposed to be a spiritual successor to the Dead Space franchise. Unfortunately, it didn't capture the same magic as the Dead Space games did, and yes, I'm talking about the Callisto Protocol. This game has got to be one of the biggest letdowns of 2022. Everything about this game just did not live up to what people had expected it to be in any aspect. The gameplay is really repetitive and quite frustrating to play. The enemy attack pattern is the same every time, so the game just devolves into dodge, swing, dodge the entire game. And the developers knew that the gameplay loop was repetitive too, so in order to add difficulty, they just threw in a bunch of enemies at you and called it a day. And this game likes to employ so many cheap tricks in order to try to kill you. Like the surprise QTE moments that drain your health every time, and sometimes they're scripted so you just lose health through no fault of your own. And it just makes the game so much more frustrating to play because so many cheap tactics are used to artificially make this game harder. Not only is the gameplay subpar, but the story is also really forgettable. None of the characters are interesting, the main character especially, and worst of all, the game isn't even scary. So instead of playing an intense survival horror game, you're just playing a shitty action game with horrible combat. I guess we just gotta wait for the actual Dead Space remake now. And last but definitely not least is a game that was supposed to be a reboot of a beloved franchise, but this time they actually used the name of the dead franchise and puppeteered its corpse to dance around like a jester on top of its own grave. This reboot was so bad that it put this franchise 6 feet deeper into the grave and barricaded it. If you haven't guessed it yet, I'm talking about Saints Row 2022, or as people like to call it, Taints Row. This game, in my opinion, is neck and neck with the Callisto Protocol in terms of the most disappointing games of 2022. Saints Row 2022 is an absolute monstrosity of a game. At least in the Callisto Protocol, the graphics were pretty good and it had a good atmosphere. Whereas Taints Row has none of that. This game literally has zero redeeming qualities about it. Like, where do I even begin? The story is atrocious. Everyone and everything in this game either makes no sense or is stupid as hell, or both. And the writing is so cringe that it makes every character so obnoxious to listen to while they try to ham-fist their political agenda down your throat, trying to masquerade as humor. The writers try to do this Gen Z humor and it's horrible. None of it is funny. It just feels like this game was written by a chronically online middle schooler whose personality was based off TikTok and Twitter. And the gameplay is just painfully generic and bland. Nothing about the gameplay is satisfying. I could watch paint dry and have just about as much fun as I did with this game. You would have more fun kicking a rock up a hill than play this game. And at least that's free. And not to mention, this game's graphics look god awful. Like, what the hell is this thing? Taints Row is a complete bastardization of the Saints Row franchise. The story is laughably bad, the characters are obnoxious, the gameplay is bland, and the graphics are hideous. There's just nothing good about this game, and that's why Taints Row is my biggest disappointment of 2022. And that's all the games I thought were the biggest letdowns this year. Even though this year had some major flops, I think overall this was a pretty good year for gaming in general. I felt like we got more good games than bad ones, but hey, maybe that's just me. Make sure you comment down below on what you thought about this list. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Was there a game I missed? And what was your most disappointing game of 2022? Also, make sure to like and subscribe for more reviews in the future. See ya.